Shabbat Shalom. How many of us have read This Is Real and You Are Completely Unprepared? Right, I saw in the announcements it's going to be the basis of the High Holiday 101 class coming up with Senior Rabbinic Fellow Joe Blumberg. So if you haven't read it yet, now's your chance. By Rabbi Alan Liu. It's an incredible book. I revisit it at least in part every year at this time in the run-up to the holidays. If I'm really ahead of myself, I'll start it right before Tisha B'Av, because he talks about Tisha B'Av too. And it's a sort of journey through the holidays, from Tisha B'Av through Elul, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, ending on Sukkot. And it leans on traditional Jewish texts and also integrates perspectives of mindfulness and meditation. And it's written by Rabbi Alan Liu, who spent much of his life pursuing Zen Buddhism. He actually has an autobiography, I think, called The Sound of One God Clapping, if I'm not mistaken, which is a great title. And abruptly, he decides to reconsider his path and returns back to his Jewish roots. And in this book, he draws on what he's learned about meditation practice and mindfulness to reflect on core Jewish ideas, casting very authentic and ancient Jewish sources in a sort of new light. So it's been an inspiration for me. I first encountered it as a rabbinic fellow here 13 years ago, I think. But it's not a perfect book, and there's one piece of it that has kind of irked me increasingly over the years that I want to sort of talk about as a way into the Parsha. Liu uses the Parshiot of the month of Elul as reflections to guide us into the holidays, including this week's Parashat Ki Tetze. It contains some of the most meaningful legislation in the Torah: animal cruelty legislation, returning lost objects and livestock, protections for workers, protections for the poor, the rule of fair weights and measures in business dealings. And it also has some of our most difficult and most challenging legislation too, including the opening verses, which describe what to do. Ki tetze la milchama, right? You go out to war. And in war, as happens apparently in the Iron Age, you take captives, and among the captives you find an eshet yefet toar, a beautiful-looking woman, and you want to take her for your wife. So the Parsha says you bring her into your household, and she trims her hair and pares her nails and discards her captive's garb. She spends a month's time in your household lamenting her father and mother, and after that, you may come to her and become her husband, and she shall become your wife. Problematic. I think we can agree on that much. Much ink has been spilled about how to deal with these verses in a lot of different contexts, but I want to sort of talk about Rabbi Liu's take on it because I actually really love it. I find it very meaningful, and I also find it increasingly unsatisfactory for a number of reasons. So in his book, of course, Rabbi Liu does not like this law either, trust me, right? He does not think this is a good thing. He describes it, though, as an ancient and human impulse that is pernicious and pervasive. But he does not condone capturing a woman in war and forcing her to become your wife. Instead, he turns this hypothetical scenario in the Torah into a sort of extended metaphor for thinking about cravings and desire from a mindfulness perspective. So he says when a craving arises in your mind, you treat it like this captive. You bring it into your household, you trim its nails, you pare its hair, you take out all the sort of trappings around it, and you sort of just let it sit there for a month or however long and watch the bare impulse of it for a time. And once it's been stripped of all its allure, and with the sort of pause, most harmful longings that you find will be revealed as fleeting and then more easily put aside. So from a spirituality perspective, from a mindfulness perspective, I think this is actually really amazing. I've tried to use this in various occasions. I think paying attention to our thoughts as they come and then giving them their moment and examining them without judgment is one of the core principles of any mindfulness or meditation practice. So I think it's a great teaching. And yet, the captive wife never entirely disappears, even when she is transformed into a metaphor. And evoking not just the Torah's specific scenario, but all sorts of explicit and implied violence against women in our tradition and beyond, I find that her ordeal is too troubling and too vivid and too devastating to just kind of be used as a parable. And the more I've reflected on this part of Rabbi Lou's teaching over the years, and the more I've really gained insight into dealing with desire and mindfulness and all these things, the more I've been unable to ignore her and the suffering that she embodies and endures, even through this sort of metaphorized teaching. At an even deeper and more subtle level, even if we could get past our revulsion and our horror, and even if we could sort of disappear the idea of the captive wife from the captive wife text, I think that metaphors like these kind of poison the groundwater of whatever is being taught in a subtle way. Rabbi Toba Spitzer writes about this in her book, God is Here, which is a book about metaphor and images for God in Jewish life, and she describes some of the science and theory behind how metaphors work. She writes, there are areas of our brain that are active not just when we're doing an action, but also when we are just thinking metaphorically about doing an action. For example, when I contemplate kicking a habit, the part of my brain that is involved when I physically kick something is activated, making the metaphor real in a powerful way. In another example, our early experience as infants being held by an adult and feeling their physical warmth becomes connected via neurons to our emotional understanding of affection, and we express this metaphorically when we say things like, my friend is a warm person. The metaphor, affection is warmth, is very much more than a turn of phrase. She writes, it becomes a basic way that we experience personal interactions. Right, so when we think about warmth of a person, there's a part of our brain that's, in some subtle way going back to the warmth we felt as an infant, being held. It's a beautiful idea when it's connected to something beautiful like that. But if we carry associations of metaphors into how we see the world, then you can see the problem when we use a problematic metaphor like the captive wife. And the way that violence against women is normalized and sort of smuggled into whatever broader point you're trying to make, even when we try to mindfulness our way out of a troubling verse. I feel this problem also very acutely when reading the Hasidic masters and these rebbes who take all the war imagery that happens to be in the Parshiot leading up to the high holidays and transforms it into these beautiful sort of similes and allegories about the war between our Yetzer HaTov and our Yetzer Hara, right? Our good and evil inclinations kind of battling within us, right? So instead of spending the month of Elul talking about warfare and all the violence, they sort of try to say, no, this is a spiritual war. This is a spiritual war. And in some ways, I think, again, this is a great technique because we do have moments, I think, inside where it feels like there are warring impulses. And it's not unlike, I think, what Rabbi Lou is trying to do in his book, which is taking something very ugly, a text that's very ugly, about a human impulse that is real but also very ugly, and doing his best to sort of find something beautiful in it. But it's still ultimately a violent metaphor. And we can't entirely escape the brutality of it, even when it is watered down to be just a symbol. I know all that, and I still don't really want to give up on all these teachings, because I love them. They contain threads that are deep and real, and they're also ours. They're part of our tradition. They're part of who we are, even when they're difficult. Ours is a chain of tradition going back 3,000 years or so. And parts of it come from what is really an entirely different world than the one we inhabit. The world of the Iron Age, the world of antiquity, different worlds in so many ways than the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And they had different blind spots and different moral failures and different ways of seeing humanity and different ways of noticing or not noticing people on the margins. And there's really no way, I think, to cut out the parts we don't like without losing links in the chain and risking the whole thing collapsing. Years ago, when I was a JTS student, I was taking clinical pastoral education, which is a chaplaincy training program, and I got into a very heated conversation with a good friend, a friendly heated conversation, who was a Unitarian Universalist minister in training when I was a rabbi in training. And at some point I sort of said, you don't understand what it's like. I have the weight of 3,000 years of tradition on me, and all the time when I want to do anything, it's so stifling, and she's like, yeah, but you don't know what it's like to not have that foundation all the time, right? You don't know what it's like to sort of have to start from scratch and sort of build and construct. And I was like, oh, I guess you're right too. And so in that moment, she helped me to see the challenge and the beauty of what we have, just as she understood, I think, the challenge and the beauty of what she had. And so there's no silver bullet, which is also a violent metaphor, unfortunately. But we can try to contextualize these sources historically. We can try to interpret them generously. We can critique them. We can reject them. We can downplay them. We can ignore them. We can metaphorize them. And each of these strategies, while imperfect, can be a help in this. And we can also, I think, work to expand our palette of images. I don't know if expanding your palate means the palate of your mouth, like the tastes, or if it means like a palette of, like a painter that's I don't know which metaphor it is. If anyone knows which one the painting one, you think? All right. I tried to look it up and I couldn't find a definitive answer. Anyway, a mixed metaphor. But if we expand our palette, our taste buds, or our colors for metaphors and what we use, and not sort of just unthinkingly rely on tired metaphors, but really explore more creative ones. And some of these don't have to be made up from scratch. We have so many in our canon, so many in our tradition. I was thinking about tshuva, which is the theme, and you have Maimonides, who thinks about it like a wake-up call, the shofar, wake up, O sleepers. Rav Kook, writing in late 19th, early 20th century, British Mandate Palestine. He writes about tshuva as light, or sometimes even, I think he says a barak nishmati, like a spiritual lightning bolt. Soloveitchik, in a famous essay, talks about tshuva as an act of self-creation, right? Of creation, like creating a new human being. All these are really beautiful metaphors, and you don't have to look far to find them. Not to mention opening up our palette to different voices and newer voices that maybe have not been part of the traditional canon. And so faced with all of these imperfect options, the path forward, I think, has to be yes and, which is loving our tradition, embracing it for what it is, without being afraid of hiding its rough edges or flaws or failures. We are taught that the Torah has 70 faces, and while each face may be imperfect, they are part of a whole whose beauty is greater than the sum of its parts. To see the Torah in its truth, we can employ all these strategies with the knowledge that they're not here to erase those problems, but to help us live with them. Part of that process I've been moved to see happening here at BJ through the Haftarah project, which many of you have written for, studied with, and it's a project where many of our members have written and reflected on the roles of violence and misogyny and intolerance in some of our sacred texts, especially in the Haftarot, and doing so as insiders in this tradition, as people who love this tradition and want it to be able to respond to the moment without pretending like things are not there. In truth, that's the only way I think we can love anything, whether it's the Torah or Judaism, whether it's a community or a country or ourselves or any other person, which is learning to love flawed things, because everything and everyone is flawed. And in this season, when we work so hard to acknowledge and repair our flaws, we know that it's the only way God can love us too, which is to love us as flawed and imperfect creatures, striving to be better and still worthy of love. Shabbat Shalom.